Good friends of ours.
All right, well, welcome everybody to Christians and Jews, past, present, and future. This will be a 3-time course. As you know, we'll meet tonight, and then we'll meet in 2 weeks, and then in 2 more weeks. We'll put out reminders and so forth. We're recording this. Some of you have a spouse or someone you know who didn't make it tonight, and we will make that, I'll try to make that link available in the next day or two, so they have an opportunity to watch. What I'd like to do is get right into it and cover a piece of this night's material, and then I'm going to stop. We're going to take a break, and at that point, when we come back, I'm going to ask you what you might want to get out of this course. But first, we need to lay a bit of foundation. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump right into that. God created Adam. And in 10 generations from Adam, the world had gotten to the point that God knew he would need to start over. And so in the 10th generation, which was Noah, I think God looked down on that little baby that was just being born and looked at that child, Noah, and said, you know, you don't know this, but in 500 years, you're going to have your first child. You're going to start your family. The 3 boys that you're going to have are going to begin in 500 years. And those 3 boys are going to be the people, the children from which I build all the children that I will ever have. And then, as you know, the flood came, and those 3 children were born, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Shem continued that line. And in 10 more generations, another boy was born, a boy named Abraham. And I don't know this for sure, but I would just guess that God looked down at that little baby as he was being born and said, you know, you don't know this yet, but in 500 years, I'm going to start a nation that's going to come from you. And this time it won't be, I'm not going to wipe out the earth again. I'm going to build from you and your seed and your nation. How many of you knew that the Exodus happened exactly 500 years after Abraham was born? Anybody heard that before? It's true. It's not 501. It's not 499. It is 500 years. And you know why I mentioned that unusual fact? Because we're going to need it later. Okay. So when Abram, we'll call him Abraham, but his name was Abram at the time. When Abram turned 70 years old, God called him. Can somebody read for us Genesis 12:1? Let's hear that call to Abraham.
The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
That's good. We will make you into a great nation, but that's good. So he's going to heed the call. And so as you can see on the screen here, you see my black cursor? So Abram lives in Ur, which is about here. And so he heeds that call. And so we just said he's 70 years old. I said he's 70 years old when he gets this call. So how many years until the Exodus from here?
430.
430. Okay. And why do I mention that crazy number? Okay, repeat after me. We're gonna need it later. Okay. So he leaves. And it turns out that we find out many, many years, hundreds of years later, that he left on Passover. Passover hadn't even been invented yet. But we learn later that the day that he left was Passover Day. The same day that the children of Israel left on the Exodus. Okay. All right. So he goes and he takes his family up to Haran. I believe I've seen that marked up in about this range. So let's come in and look at that. So now it says that he's going to leave. He's going to have to leave his relatives and his father's house. But the Bible says that his father goes with him. Terah goes with him, and a whole bunch of people go with him. And they go to Haran, and they stay there 5 years. And then Terah, Abraham's father, dies. And so now it's time for Abraham to continue the journey. We don't have a lot of explanation on that, but it's if his father was elderly, he wanted to care for him. So when his father died, he continued his journey. So let's look at that path. So he would have gone up the Euphrates River, which is this large dark mark here. The Euphrates and the Tigris River is over here, if you're wondering. The Euphrates River, and he would have circled around and come down through Damascus. And we actually know pretty much his route because the Bible says that he went to Shechem. And Shechem is today called Nablus. You see it right here? Is this good enough? You can kind of see that? Okay. So Shechem is called Nablus. And so if he was going to do that, he would have come down this Yabok River, and there is a nice crossing point over the Jordan right here, and then he would have headed up this particular valley called the Tirzah Valley today. So he gets to the river, and it's time to cross into the Promised Land. Now, there are no Jews. There are no Israelis. There's only Abraham. And Abraham at this time is known as a Hebrew. Now, why is he known as a Hebrew? It comes from one of his great-grandfathers. Anybody know the name? His fifth, if you look at the lineage from Shem down to Abraham, if you go back up to spot number 5, you have Eber. 5 generations back from Abraham, 10, let's see, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. Yes, so the 5th generation down in between Shem and Abraham is Eber. Eber. Do you hear the E-B-R in that? Eber, okay? So Hebrew. Hebrew.
Oh.
So you put the H on the front, the W on the back, and you got Eber. Hebrew. Now, why is Abraham called a Hebrew? We don't really know, but I have 2 ideas, just personally. Well, one of them's personal. The other is one of I haven't read. One I have. He's known. I think he's known as Eber. Now Eber's still alive because these guys back in Shem, they're living a long time still. So he's still alive. I think that Eber was probably there at the Tower of Babel, and when God confused all the languages, Eber spoke Hebrew. And so Abraham, coming from that line, would continue to speak Hebrew. Okay? That's one reason. The other reason I can think is, I just think that maybe some people saw in Abraham something that was in Eber. Okay, so Abraham is about to cross over into the Promised Land. And why did I make this big point about Hebrew and Eber? It's because what does Eber mean? It means to cross over. So what an appropriate name for Abraham if he's crossing over into the Promised Land to follow God's promises, okay? What is he crossing over here? What do you see? We've got the Sea of Galilee here, got the Dead Sea. What's he crossing? He's crossing the Jordan River, right? But one of the beauties of this Google Maps is I can do this. And he's crossing the Jordan River, but the Jordan River is part of a major tectonic system on the earth called the East African Rift. It's at the top end of it. And you look down and you see there's a valley here, and the Jordan River goes all the way down into the Gulf of Aqaba, and then it goes right down through the middle of the Red Sea, and then it turns and heads down this way to where, what's the big lake in
Victoria.
Lake Victoria in Africa? And I was looking at on the map this afternoon, and it goes right along next to where that lake is. So this is a major dividing line that God has established between east and west of the world. You've got the east world, you've got the western world. So not only is he crossing into what will be the promised land, but he's crossing in from the east side of the world to the west side of the world. Beautiful, isn't it? Okay, so Abraham gets on the into. Let's take a look at. Let's take a look at this in 3D. He's come down the Yabok River valley right here. He's come and he's crossed over at this nice crossing point, and he's heads up the Tirzah Valley, and then he hits to Shechem, number 40 there. And he spends most of his life in the mountains. You see how there's a spine of mountains that goes up and down Israel today. And so he's there for a while, and then something hits him. Something he didn't expect. A famine. He's coming to God's promised land, and there's a famine. So what does he have to do?
Go to Egypt.
He has to go to Egypt. So he goes down to Egypt, and I'll learn how to do this faster as we go. So he goes back, so he goes over to Egypt, and he doesn't stay there long. He comes back with Hagar and a lot of possessions, comes back into Israel. And so, but we're not going to cover all the life of Abraham. I just want to hit a few spots. Can somebody read Genesis 14:18? Because Abraham introduces to us a city in Genesis 14:18. And we're going to need that city.
And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High.
Okay. So Jerusalem, the earliest name of Jerusalem was Salem. So that's the first mention of Salem in the Bible, of Jerusalem in the Bible. Okay. Now, sometime later, God appears to Abraham and he gives him a promise about the future. Let's read this promise in Genesis 15:13.
Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there."
Okay, so this is a promise that God is giving. And we know this as the promise of going to Egypt again. Why do I bring this up? It's because of that number 400. He said, your descendants, the Hebrew there is actually your seed, will be strangers in the land not their own, enslaved for 400 years. Now, when I grew up, I always heard that they were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt. That's not true. The math doesn't work out. What that prophecy really means is that from the moment that he has a son, the son of promise, that we will begin counting 400 years. Okay, so when we'll be talking about an Isaac in just a moment. But before we do that, let's cover one massively key promise in Genesis 17:8. Can somebody read that? God says to Abraham, what? Genesis 17:8.
I will give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are now foreigners, all the land of Canaan
Okay.
as a permanent possession.
Okay. I have this. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. This is an unconditional promise.
Yes.
So we know from this that God is giving this land, all this land of what is then called Canaan, or Canaan would be the Hebrew, that he is giving him and his descendants this land forever. And he's promising to be their God. An amazing, amazing promise, especially given what's to come. Okay, and then we have Isaac. Isaac is born, and God starts a 400-year clock on that year.
Okay.
So we are now 400 years from the Exodus. And over time, Isaac is sojourning in the land of Canaan, and he gets hit with something, a famine. So what does he do? Let's find out what he does in Genesis 26:2.
The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I shall tell you."
Right, do not go down to Egypt. So Isaac does not go, even though that would have been the normal course. Instead, what he did is he went to the coastal areas and got connected with some of the Philistines there. Okay? All right, so he stays in the land. And then Isaac has Esau and Jacob. And Jacob, you know the story, how Jacob has to leave because of stealing the birthright of Esau. He needs to get out. And where does Jacob go? Or at least, I didn't actually look it up today if it's Ur, if it's Padam Haran. So it would be back in that area. But so I sort of had imagined that it would be kind of in this part of what would be Assyria or Syria today. But the point is that he crossed back to the east. So none of the patriarchs had done this. Once Abraham crosses over, why? Isn't this backtracking? This is going backwards. This is like the opposite of God's plan. You're supposed to be in the land. You've been promised. But he's leaving the land, and he spends 20 years out there. He spends 7 years to win Leah. Although he thinks he's trying to win Rachel, but he really spends the first 7 years to win his first wife, Leah. And then he spends the next 7 years paying for the earning of his second wife, Rachel, because he got both of them within a week. But then the second one, he had to stay another 7 years. And then he spent another 6 years with Laban. Some people say Laban. It's Laban in Hebrew, or Laban. And he's practically a slave this whole time. You see, the clock started with Isaac being born because they're not in a land of their own. Isaac has to deal with the Philistines and try to curry favor with them and try to not get in trouble where he is. Jacob is practically a working servant for his uncle. And it's going to stay that way until everyone goes down to Egypt. Well, let's help Jacob get back. So Jacob is going to leave under quick circumstances. He's packed up everything. He's had 11 sons already there, and it's time to come back to the promised land. So the Bible in this case is very explicit. It says that he makes their way down to what is now the Golan Heights, and Laban catches up with them, and they have this agreement. And then after that, he continues on, and he continues on the path of Abraham. He comes right back into the Jabbok River Valley right here. He's heading back in the same path of Abraham, and right in the middle of this valley, he has that encounter with God. That wrestling with God. And that's where we first see the name Israel in the Bible, because he had that encounter with God. Let's hear that. Genesis 32:28.
Then the man said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome."
Okay. And that verse is still prophetic today. even of the conversation that we're going to have over this course regarding the relationship of Christians and Jews. It's not an easy relationship. There is a struggle there. Okay. All right. So one other thing I want to talk about here is before he crosses over, like his father Abraham, he has an encounter. He's been dreading Esau for these 20 years. And so he meets him by the Jabbok River. We can zoom into this river valley here. So somewhere out here, maybe it's out in the flats before the Jordan River, but there's the river valley. Somewhere out in here, he meets Esau. And Esau is undone by all the gifts that he's been given, and the way Jacob treats him. He bows down 7 times, and finally when they meet, they embrace. And Esau says, "Brother, come with me. Come with me. Come with me to where I live in Seir." Let's hear that in Genesis 33. Cue up Genesis 33:14, because Jacob says, "No, that's okay," but Esau says, "No, brother, come with me," and he says, "No, look, it would be a hard journey for all my flocks and my kids." He said, "No." Esau says, "No, please come. I'll escort you. We'll help protect all of you. Just come, and we want you to come together with us and live with us." And Jacob is trying to figure out some way to get out of this thing. And so finally, in Genesis 33:14, he says, someone read it.
"Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, and I will lead on softly, according as a cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure, until I come unto my Lord, unto Seir." Okay.
So, Jacob says, "Please, go on ahead, and I will take whatever time I need to take with my flocks and everything else." But he didn't go there. And I want to show you where is Seir. Seir is, if you look, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea. Seir is about halfway between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, but it's on the Jordan side. Look over here. It's right in here. There's a mountain and there's a high area. It's pretty good land for Jordan right there. And I'm thinking, Esau, why did you leave the land? Yeah. Your brother got out of there. You had the run of the place, but you voluntarily decide to leave the promised land? Is it any wonder why in the New Testament we read from Paul that God hated Esau because he despised his birthright? He wouldn't even take it when he had the easy opportunity to. And why do I bring this up about Seir? Because we're gonna need this later. Okay. All right. So then Jacob now crosses over with all of his family. He went to Shechem. There's problems there with his daughter Dinah, and then he makes his way down, and many things happen, and then Joseph, goes off to see the brothers one time, and there's this, they hate him because of the dreams that he's had, and they sell him into slavery, and they push him down into Egypt. And you know the story, and we won't go through it, about how Joseph rises to power, and eventually they make a connection. And why did they make a connection? Because something hit them. What?
Famine.
A famine. This time, the worst famine that had ever hit the world, according to Scripture, is a famine that covered the entire world. And Jacob, at that point, Israel was really afraid to leave the promised land, given that that's what had been given. So God has to comfort him. So let's read what God says in Genesis 46:3.
I am God, the God of your father, the voice said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make your family into a great nation.
Read that last phrase again. For there
I will make your family into a great nation.
This has been the promise all along. This is what God was looking for, was to bring out a nation. People, fine. Families, fine. And even there's the promise to Abraham, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. It's wonderful. But God was looking for something, for a people group, a nation that would be his. Okay, so they go down to Egypt. All the 12 sons. There's about 70 of them in all, and you see that as a prophetic of the Israel and the world, the 12 and the 70. So they're in Egypt. Okay, so let's not get up, but take a deep breath. We've made it to Egypt. Okay. If you've got some water, I got some Nile River right here, some fresh Nile River. Get a drink. We're going to need a water stop. It's now 200 years before the Exodus. We're at about 200 years before the Exodus, and things are good, really good. Now, let's move to 80 years before the Exodus. Moses is born 80 years before the Exodus, and things are horrible. He just barely makes it out alive in the little, cradle, the ark. And he grows up, he learns who he is, he turns 40 years old, and he sees an Egyptian flogging an Israelite, and he kills the Egyptian. And then Pharaoh hears about it, and Moses has to run for his life. We are now 40 years from the Exodus. So let's hear where Moses went. Exodus 2:15.
When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well.
Okay. So he fled from Pharaoh. My translation says the presence of Pharaoh, or we could think of it as the dominion of Pharaoh. He had to get out of any place that Pharaoh had any opportunity to kill him. So where did he go? He went to Midian. We'll get to Midian in a second. But first, he had to get out of Egypt. So where does Egypt end? This is one of the things that many people don't realize when they're reading their Bible, is that Egypt is not just this area between what is the Suez Canal today and down, but it includes the Sinai Peninsula. This peninsula right here, which is now today we call it the Sinai Peninsula, but this was Egypt. There were mining operations in this part of the country. There were Egyptian workers there. In order to leave Egypt, he would have to get past Sinai into what is now today Saudi Arabia. Okay, so he would have taken the way of the wilderness, which goes right along here and goes to Eilat today, what is today, the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. And then from here, he has to find, he doesn't know where he's going, but he ends up in Midian. So let's find Midian. It's probably going to be in Saudi Arabia somewhere. And this is even scholars who do not believe any of the Bible will agree with what I'm about to tell you about where Midian is. But it's here in Saudi Arabia. Okay, we're going to find Midian together right now. Okay, are you ready? Now, I'm going to ask you to say in unison 2 cities. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question, and the answer is the 2 cities. And I'll help you with the first one. The 2 holiest cities in Saudi Arabia today are Mecca and Medina. The two holiest cities in Saudi Arabia today are Mecca and, say it louder please,
Medina.
Medina. And where did Moses go?
Midian.
Close.
That's it. You see how Eber became Hebrew? But it has the same consonants. Midian, Medina. It's really the M, D, and N. It's the same place. We just move in until we see, oops, there it is. See it? It's right in the center now. So that's where he would have gone. What is today Medina? The land hasn't changed. So he went down there and he got married and he shepherded flocks for 40 years and he thought things were over for him. And then it says something happened in Exodus 3:1. Will someone read that one?
Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb.
Right. That translation is a good one. It says the backside of the desert. Others say the western side. But Moses would have gotten to know this whole area, over 40 years for sure. And it turns out that there's some pretty high ground at the backside of this wilderness where you can get up pretty high and get some grass. It's over 5,000 feet high in some of these places. And so you can get some grass for your flocks if it's not raining. And, which, of course, it's wilderness. And so, would it make any sense for him to have taken his flocks into the Sinai Peninsula? No. It's still Egypt. Egypt is a mighty power. You don't take your flocks over into Egyptian territory. You stay in your own territory. And indeed, this is really where Mount Sinai is. It's in Arabia. And just to make sure that it isn't me saying it, I'll just quote a friend that we would all like to meet in heaven one day. His name is Paul, and he says in Galatians 4:25, now this, and he's making an analogy about Hagar. Now this Hagar is Sinai, Mount Sinai in Arabia. Paul tells us where it is. So this idea that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula is a real problem because there's no archaeological evidence there for it. And there's hardly any room for them to wander for 40 years. But if Mount Sinai is here in this backside of the desert in Saudi Arabia, then my goodness, look at all this area that they could have wandered for 40 years. And the candidate, which I've come to the conclusion that there's just no other candidate that fits all of the scriptural evidence, is Jebel al-Az. It's a mountain in Saudi Arabia. So I'm not going to go into more detail on this right now, but I wanted everybody that comes through this course to at least know where Mount Sinai is. It is in Arabia, just like Paul said it was. And interestingly, it's almost due south of Jerusalem. Just right due south of Jerusalem. Okay, so you won't need that later, but I want you to know it. Okay, so now, it's time for the Exodus. The burning bush, he goes, the plagues, and the children of Israel come out on Passover for the Exodus. On Passover day, they'd done their Passover Seder the night before, and they come out on Passover. And I'm not going to go over the route. You could ask it in a later class if you want. If you want, I'm not going to go over the route. But the point is if they're going to Mount Sinai, they're crossing back east, just like Jacob did. They're going east. Okay? Now we know what happens. They try to come back into Israel in only 2 years, but they didn't have the faith. God said, "Time, go. It's time to take the land." And they wanted to send the spies out, and let's talk about this. And so the 12 spies came back, and these were major figures in the land. These were big shot guys. They were heads of their tribes, and 10 of them says, "There's giants in the land. We shouldn't do it." And there's 2 guys that stand up. One is Joshua from the tribe of Judah, and one is Caleb from the tribe of Ephraim. They stand up and say, "We can do this thing." And God says, no, we don't have enough buy-in. So you're going to have to wander until everyone dies off who isn't 20. It's going to be 38 more years. Now, we think of this as like punishment. But keep in mind, they got manna every day. They got water. Their sandals didn't wear out. Their clothing didn't wear out. And any enemy that attacked them got totally vanquished. It's a pretty good deal for a wilderness story. Okay? And they got closer to God, and they got ready to go in. So it's time for them to go into the land. Where did they go in? Y'all know this. Where did they cross over?
East of Jericho.
Yes, they crossed over right across from Jericho, right here. But wait, this picture was rolling so wonderfully. We had Abraham crossing up here. We had Jacob crossing up here. And the children of Israel, they cross over down here. Well, God gives a little wink to Abraham and to Jacob, because the water backs up at a little town called Adam, which is right here where they crossed. So the water backs up at the spot where Abraham and Jacob crossed, and then they go right across to Jericho. Isn't God beautiful? He thinks of the details, He wants everything to kind of tie up and come together in a cohesive story. All right, so they've crossed over. We have Joshua leading. We have Judges. We have the kings are established. King David is established, and King David finally takes Jerusalem. Where is Jerusalem up here? Let's be right there. So King David finally takes Jerusalem hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after they went into the land. It took a long, long time for them to get that Jebusite city. And when did he get it? He got it at 1000 BC. This is the first BC date I've given you, 1000 BC. This is the approximate time when David took Jerusalem. That's when the life of Jerusalem begins. This is just a good number to keep in mind. Okay, so take a deep breath. There is a beautiful spring underneath Jerusalem called Gihon Spring. And so I'm going to pretend I'm drinking some Gihon. I'm going to take a water break. Okay. We need to get to Jesus. So let's move. 1000 BC, Solomon comes and he builds the temple in Jerusalem. And the nation in this time is known by one name. What's the name? Now, they're not Hebrews anymore. They're not Israelites. It's the nation of Israel. Okay, so Israel has been established as a nation. It's a nation under King David and Solomon, and it has renown around the world. But in the time of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, the kingdom split. Let's look at that. It's split. And why did it split? Well, the God reason is because Solomon didn't do right before the Lord, and God wouldn't let that nation continue under one king based on his sin. The more human reason is a pretty basic reason that we still know today. The people of the northern tribes said, "You're taxing us too much, And we don't have any representation in this government. And so we don't think there should be any taxation without representation. Okay, so the tribes split and into 10 tribes in the north and 2 tribes in the south. 2 tribes in the south are mainly Judah and Benjamin. And the south is very, very angry. This is not right. This can't be God. This is cause for civil war. And so they gather their army and they start amassing to head up to the northern kingdom to take it back by force because it is the right thing to do. And the prophets race out and say, wait, you need to inquire of the Lord. And so they inquire of the Lord. And can somebody read 1 Kings 12:24? What does the Lord say?
This is what the Lord says, do not go up to fight against your brothers.
Do not go up. Yes, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again as the Lord had ordered.
You know, God bless those people for going back home after being all roused up to go to war. Do you know some of the hardest thing it is to do right is to do nothing? One of the hardest things to obey the Lord and do is to do nothing when he says to do nothing. Or when he doesn't say to do something. To wait until he says. And he says, this thing has come from me. I think this is the first that I know of, the first godly separation in a kingdom. And the fact that we have this northern kingdom, southern kingdom, we're going to use this analogy in this course. We're going to come back to this because we can learn some things about the separation between Christians and Jews today. So, but when you read your Bible from this point in the story on, there is the possibility of confusion. Because the whole land used to be called Israel, right? And now, what does it say here? It says Israel and Judah. Wait. Why is the northern Israel? I mean, Jerusalem is still intact, and God didn't say he was displeased with all the people down there. So from this point on in the Bible, when you read Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and these prophets, you have to be very, very careful what you're seeing. Because this land can be referred to as the northern kingdom and the southern, yes. It can be called the Jeroboam territory and the Rehoboam territory. It can be called Israel and Judah. And it can also be called by the name of the lead tribe in each area, Ephraim and Judah. Ephraim is the lead tribe in the northern kingdom. And lastly, sometimes these lands are called by their names of Samaria in the north and Judea in the south. So Judea is a land area, Judah is a tribe. So the land can be called Judah because it's the lead tribe, but it's also the land of Judea. Now, when you're reading in these books, you will also see other times which God refers to both. Sometimes he can make it really clear. Ephraim and Judah will do such and such. Well, you know. Also, when you see the whole house of Israel, I don't know of cases where the whole house of Israel doesn't mean everything. Okay, and lastly, the land of Israel, because the land, God never stops referring to the land as the land of Israel. You know, even when it's no longer Israel and Jesus goes down to Egypt, the angel says, go back to the land of Israel. And it even Israel did. It's a province of Rome. Okay, but it's still called Israel. It's still Israel in God's eyes.
Where are the Jews?
We're coming. We're coming. Okay, so the Northern Kingdom, it lasts about 300 years. They last about 300 years. And let me go to this. This. Let's look at them. So here's the breakout of the tribes a little bit, and you see Ephraim here. Look how much land there is in the Northern Kingdom.
Yeah.
But Reuben, everything except Judah and Benjamin and Simeon is gone by then. This is a different map. But Ephraim is a relatively small territory. How does the Northern Kingdom rule? It rules as a federation. And as far as I know, this is a new idea in world history at this point. The land is ruled as a federation. What that means is Ephraim, as the lead tribe, isn't conquering the other tribes. They're allowing each of them to coexist where they are and live peacefully. There's freedom. Each tribe gets to choose some things, but there's some things that there's no freedom on. For instance, you got to pay your taxes. If there is a threat from an external enemy, you got to come together and fight, right? We'll use this federation we're gonna trade with each other. We'll trade outside. We'll increase our wealth together. Oh, and also there's freedom of religion.
Oh, man.
You know, in fact, there's so much freedom of religion, it just goes to a lot of immorality, right? But Ephraim isn't demanding what the religion should be either. Freedom of religion. All right. So they are exiled in 721 BC to Assyria. And so we'll take ourselves back to Assyria. So they are exiled. The Northern Kingdom is exiled into this area up here, Assyria. Actually, they work their way on down into this whole area here. Okay? Now, the Southern Kingdom survives, and that Southern Kingdom is exiled 130 years later in 586 BC. This is a number that should kind of learn to come off your tongue. 586 BC, the date of the exile of the Southern Kingdom. The Jews, that Southern Kingdom is being exiled, and Nebuchadnezzar is ruling things, and they're exiled to Babylon.
Did you say 130 years?
It's about 130 years between 721 and 586. The actual, you can calculate 721 minus 586. Now, each of these, when I'm giving you one date, but in reality, it comes in several waves. Okay, so now they're all in Babylon and this whole area. And it's time that the Bible will introduce one of the names for our course. Esther 2:5. Can somebody read Esther 2:5?
Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son
Good.
of Shimei,
Good.
the son of Kish.
Thank you. So he was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin. So therefore, what does the word Jew refer to?
Judah.
Judah in the sense of the tribe, or Judah in the sense of the Southern Kingdom?
Southern Kingdom.
Judah in the sense of the Southern Kingdom. Because it's Judah and Benjamin. And it's also Judea. Jew also works for Judea because that's the area that they're coming from. Okay. All right, so that's where, and from then on you start to see the word Jew used more and more.
Yeah.
All right, especially in the New Testament. Okay, so then after Nebuchadnezzar comes Cyrus, and he makes this decree that he's going to allow the Jews to go back to their land.
Is that the first occurrence of the word Jew?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. In chronological order of time, yes. So then Cyrus says, I'm going to let the Jews go back and start to rebuild the temple. And so he puts out this decree to the entire land. Anybody who wants to come. He doesn't write, if you consider yourself a Jew from Judah, whatever. But just, if anybody wants to come, Go do it. Now, there's millions of Jews there. They're millions. But how many respond to the call? Only about 30,000. 30,000 make their trek from Ur back, following that ancient path of their forefathers. So, to do this, it's a dangerous route. It's not going to be easy. You're going to be in poverty. How are you going to support yourself there? It's not easy. These people were cream. They weren't slouches. They're like those early pioneers to America or something. I mean, they're hard stock. They're willing to gut it out and try to do it because they believed it was the right thing to do, to go back and build the temple. And they were successful, and they did. They rebuilt the temple. And slowly but surely, the Jews in that area that we now call Israel grew into where there was millions again. And the Greeks came, but they were never their own country. After Cyrus, the Greeks ruled them for a while, and then the Romans began to rule them in 150 BC. Let's shift back here for a second. What's happening to the Jews over here? Well, they're still there. But there's been some regime changes going on. Because after Cyrus came the Persians, and then after the Persians came the Greeks with Alexander the Great, and after the Greeks came, about the same time the Romans started to gain power. This group in the east began to gain power, and they were called the Parthians. And they became an empire, actually. Now, who were these people, the Parthians? Well, tell you one thing who they were. Let me pull this up on a map. I've got it right here. Yeah. Oops. It's not a really, really great map. It's okay. So here's the Mediterranean Sea over here. Here would be Israel. This would be Babylon, Tigris, Euphrates rivers, and so forth. This is Afghanistan today. So this empire here, Parthian Empire, is the only empire the Romans never conquered. Huh. But there was wars. But they never conquered them. The Romans hated the Parthians. They said that they were barbarians. They said that they were scum. There is more literature written in Rome about the Parthians than any other people group in the world. Because they were writing about them because they hated them and they couldn't beat them. Every time they would attack, it would get beaten back. And actually, the Parthians even advanced all the way to cover what is now Turkey. They went all the way to Constantinople, but they didn't stay. They didn't stay in Turkey. They came back to their own borders. Why? They didn't want to conquer back. Wait, the Romans wanted to conquer all of Parthia. Parthia didn't want to conquer the Roman Empire. Okay, so who are these people? Well, nobody knows. So they say, they're like, they're definitely not Persian because they don't look like Persian. And they're definitely not from there originally because they knew they were nomadic somehow. They were drifters or something. Right. Okay, how did these people rule? Turns out they ruled like a federation. They didn't conquer all the different people groups within their territory. Instead, they allowed each people group or even each city govern itself to a reasonable degree. Although everybody had to pay their taxes. And if there was a threat from Rome, everybody had to put in for the national defense and send their boys in. Who do you think these people might be? Sure sounds a lot like the same kind of way that the northern kingdom worked. Well, this group, they were actually very fierce warriors, and they didn't accept the Roman legions in the way they would attack from different angles. They were innovative, and they were fast with chariots and horses. That's why they always beat them. But finally, in about maybe 40 BC, I don't have an exact date on this one, Rome said, we're tired of going to war with Parthia. Let's meet. And the heads of Parthia and the heads of Rome came and they met on an island in the Euphrates River. And they declared a detente. Not a peace. Just declared that they weren't going to attack each other for a while. And they agreed. And it held for 80 years. And that detente, that pseudo-tension-filled sort of peace, was the period of time in which Christ was born. He had a stable situation in which to live for his entire life of 33 years. His life was encapsulated into that stability for 80 years. This is God. This is God. And when Christ was born in 1 BC, some magi came from the east, it says. Never says there was 3.
More like a 3,000.
If you were Parthia and you had heard something about the Messiah coming, and you know that you've got a detente going on with, and this is like the United States and Soviet Union, many years ago. You're not going to send 3 people. You're going to send at least hundreds, if not 1,000. And you're going to come in quickly. And when you come into Jerusalem, what do you think? What is Herod going to think, right? I mean, this is not good. The enemy has just arrived. And the Bible says Jerusalem was in an uproar.
Yeah.
Well, makes sense. I don't think there's any doubt that these people were Parthians. And somehow, I believe that they were descended from the 10 tribes. It makes a lot of sense to do so. Okay, so we shift now to 33 AD, and it is Passover. And Jesus dies on the cross. And then we know he's raised on Sunday. And then 50 days later, we have Pentecost. And we have a bunch of Jews gathered there at Pentecost. Can somebody read about the Jews that had come from various lands on Acts 2:9? Give me a second. Hold on. I want to point out in our map where these people are. Okay, Acts 2:9. These are the people that on whom the Holy Spirit is about to fall, right?
When they heard in their native languages.
Yes.
Parthians, Medes.
Stop. Parthians. Now, there's 12, 13, 14 names here. Parthians is the first on the list. Why do you think it's first on the list? You typically put your largest people group first on the list, wouldn't you? Parthian is still an empire, and yet some Jews were slipping in. Okay, Parthians. So let me try to walk through, and I will use my cursor. Frank, read them out about 1 second in between, and I'll put my cursor on where they are. Okay, go ahead.
Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea.
Right, sorry. Judea, right in the middle of Israel, of course. Okay.
Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya near Cyrene, and visitors from Rome.
And Rome, there's still more.
Both Jews and converts. Cretans.
Cretans, go to Crete right here.
Arabs.
And Arabs. Down here. That's the list.
Where are the Caucasian mountains?
Caucasus Mountains are right there.
Okay.
All right, so I want to. We went through the pattern fast, but what we did is we started in the east. Look, watch my cursor. We started in the east. We went to Judea. Then we went up north into Turkey. Then we went to the west in Egypt, Libya, Rome, and Crete. And finally, we ended in the south. All 4 directions. Okay, so Christ has come, Christ has risen, and in that day, every person there that saw Jesus and knew that he was the resurrected Messiah was Jewish. Let's take a break. I wonder if a couple of you might give me a sentence or two of things that you were hoping you might get out of this course, because really the course is starting now. We've laid our foundation. And I won't be able to react to that tonight, but I'm thinking for the next couple of classes as I begin to plan that. Yes, Bill? Okay. Great. Thank you. Somebody did a map of all the locations of the people from the different Jews from the different areas. I mentioned this to someone, I'll say it again, that Josephus Flavius in around 70, 80 AD wrote that he knew where the 10 tribes were. There's no question. They are on the other side of the Euphrates, and they're too numerous to count. They are a great multitude, he said. Okay. All right, so here we are at Pentecost, and all the Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, well, they're all Jews, that's the first thing, and they are called Nazarenes. They're called Nazarenes because Jesus was from Nazareth, and of course Nazareth comes from Netzer, which is a branch, and there's prophecies about a righteous branch springing up. We take that as a Christian prophecy, and so it's Netzer. So the Jews in this early time were a sect, the believing Jews. They were not separated from the rest of the Jews. They were just those that had believed that the Messiah had come. You know, there's various sects. There was a lot of talk about the Messiah in those days, and so those who believed were there was some persecution, you know, Stephen and so forth, but it didn't last for that long, and basically for most of between 33 AD and 70 AD, there was reasonable coexistence in Israel. Some Jews even became to believe in Jesus during that time period. So it would be 7 years from this moment in Pentecost, 7 years before we would have the first Gentile Christian. And that guy's name was Cornelius. And Cornelius was in Caesarea. That's how we say it in English. It's also said Caesarea would be how you'd say it today, and it's still a town. So it's been rebuilt as a town in Israel, Caesarea. So he came on the scene 7 years. So 7 years, the church was completely Jewish for 7 years. Then, 5 years later, so now we're 12 years, 5 years later, there started to be some Gentiles from Cyprus that had been interacting over here with Antioch in Syria, Lebanon. I don't know exactly where that ancient Antioch was. But they needed a new name. Jews didn't work anymore because there was some Gentiles, and so they came with the name Christian. So the name Christian came 12 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then, but it still wasn't a big deal. That's where the name was introduced. But it really wasn't a big deal until Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey to Cyprus and then on up into Turkey and back. And boy, the doors opened and just many, many Gentiles came in. And at that point, all the Jews knew, the Jewish believers knew that this thing was going to change somehow. And so then they called in the Jerusalem Council to deal with this question of what would we do with these Gentiles? How much of the Jewish law should they keep? And we're not going to go into those details. We might touch that in the next week or so, where I'm just going to move on. But that was 17 years after Jesus, before the Gentile issue was a big enough issue that it really needed to be decided.
You mean after Pentecost or after?
After Pentecost,
Yeah.
which was 50 days after
Right,
Passover,
right,
when
right.
Jesus, yes, so 17 years after that,
When
yes.
was Paul saved?
Paul was saved pretty soon. I think he was saved in. Someone must know it. I can't remember. I think it was in the first 7 years, though. I think it was just several years after Jesus. Okay, so now up through 70 AD, the believing Jews still went to the temple in Jerusalem with the rest of the Jews. That temple was doing sacrifices, but they would still go there. The book of Hebrews was written to the Jews in Jerusalem. Okay, so that's an insight there. And the believing Jews were accepted as a sect of Judaism. But there was one big problem that came up before 70 AD, and that was in Rome. Remember that one of the groups that was listed as being there at Pentecost were some Jews from Rome, Jews and others from Rome. And Paul needed to write a letter to the Romans because of a problem that had developed in about 55, 60 AD, something like this. So we're 43, 53. So we're 25, at least 25 years on into this. He needed to write a letter to the Romans because there was a big problem. You see, can someone look up Acts 18, 1 and 2? I'll need it in a minute. There were 4 phases to the church in Rome. Phase 1, everybody in the church was ethnically Jewish. Phase 2, the Gentiles had come in to salvation and joined with those believers in Rome. They were a joint community of Jew and Gentile together as the Church of Rome. And in stage 3, we'll learn what stage 3 was when somebody will read Acts 18, 1 and 2. Loudly, please.
After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he
There.
went to see them.
Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. This was the first expulsion of Jews from a locality. Claudius was emperor at the time, and he believed that there would be more peace from these controversial, Jews for them to get out. And when he kicked the Jews out, he kicked the Jews. If you were Jewish, you're out. Doesn't matter whether you believe in Jesus or not. You're Jewish. So all the Jews left for about 5 years. And those that believed in Jesus, those that did not. They all left. And so, for the next 5 years, the church in Rome was led and run exclusively by Gentiles. And in the 4th phase of the church, Claudius realized that what he had done was really bad for business and the economy, and so he let him back in. And the Jews tried to join in with the church. And the Gentiles, they were running things now. And they really didn't want them back. And Paul was understood. This could become the first, what we'd say now, the first denominational split in the church. So he wrote to them a letter explaining everything from A to Z about salvation. But the point of that whole letter was Romans 9, 10, and 11. And in most Bible studies in the Christian church today, we go through Romans 1 through 8, and then we jump to Romans 12 and continue. But Romans 9, 10, 11 was the whole point of the letter, because the problem was, how do Jews and Gentiles get along? And he even enlarged the discussion to include Jews who don't believe or yet believe in Jesus as Messiah. So that letter is the best case study we have, and if you want to think about this issue of the problems and the opportunities, it's in the book of Romans. And we'll refer to that later. Okay, but I got to move on. Because 70 AD comes, and this second temple is about to be destroyed. We know this from history. And Vespasian surrounds Jerusalem with his armies in about 67, 68. But then there's a problem in Rome, and he gets called back. There's a coup, so he has to go back to Rome for a year, year and a half. And now he's the emperor. And so he sends his son to finish the job. So Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, but then there's a reprieve, and then they come back. But Jesus had warned the disciples in these discourses that he was giving about the future. There's one in Matthew that talks about all these things that are going to happen. And there's another one in Luke. And they're not exactly the same. And many scholars have come back today and said, the one that Jesus talked about that was recorded in Matthew hasn't happened. But the one that Jesus talked about in Luke did happen in 70 AD. And Jesus said to them, in Luke 21:20, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in her midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city." All right. Jesus said, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So Jerusalem is in Judea, and Jerusalem is being surrounded by armies. They're surrounded from the north. Now this area is all pretty mountainous. We talked about that before, right? So here's the mountains of Judea, and we got Jerusalem right here. Okay, flee to the mountains. Where are you going to flee? Where are you going to flee? Jerusalem's on the top of the hills anyway. It's the top of the ridge. It's 2,500 feet. That's why the climate's good. So we're going to flee to other mountains? Well, the mountains, Hebron's a little bit higher, but then it's going to start going down. There's not really much mountains here.
So where? Get out of town.
Flee to the mountains.
Flee to the mountains?
No,
There
are mountains.
Is what it said. Flee to the mountains.
Yeah, go past the Judean wilderness.
So, here's what they did. The believing Jews, Jerusalem's mostly Jews. The believing Jews remembered the words of Jesus, and they left when Vespasian went back to Rome. They didn't say, oh, maybe the coast is clear. No. They managed their affairs. They got things ready, and they left. But those who didn't accept the words of Jesus as valid stayed. And that's why 2 million Jews died in 70 AD when Titus came back. But those that believed, which wasn't the largest percentage or anything, those that believed went to Mount Seir. Remember I said we'd need that later? They went down and crossed over into what is now Jordan. And now I said Mount Seir was here. And where they went was a much better fortified place, which is right up in...
Now that's not the same as Mount Sinai.
No.
No. Okay, yes. So let's look at our bearings here.
This isn't speculation,
This
right, Bob?
this is
No.
this is Galilee. This is Dead Sea. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. Mount Sinai's down here. They went near to Mount Seir, which is right here, halfway in between, but on the Jordan side. And they went to a place called Petra. Ever heard of Petra? Petra is right in here, and right in there. And let me show you what Petra looks like, because I had the...
So did they cross the Jordan to go there?
They crossed the Jordan. I'm glad you mentioned that, because just like Jacob, just like in the Exodus, they went across the great African rift to the east side. They left the land to do it. And so they went to Petra, and there's an example. So Petra is a fortified area. It's an enclosed area that has a very narrow entrance. It would be very easy to defend. So that's how wide it is. It's not just that deep. And then you go in, and it opens up into something like that.
Wow.
Now, what is built here is tombs of the kings of Egypt and so forth from way, way back. These were there at that time, but the Jews, I mean, they were just looking for a place to hole up.
Were there caves?
There's caves all over in there.
Yeah. Eusebius talks about the church escaping to Pella, P-E-L-L-A, but pretty much there's agreement that Pella and Petra are the same thing.
All right, so,
Is it near Mount Seir?
yes, it's only about 10 miles away from Mount Seir. Okay. Now, does that mean that prophecy is fulfilled? I don't think so, and we'll talk about that later in this course. But it was a fulfillment. It was an initial fulfillment of it. Okay, so all right, now, so we're 70 AD, and Jerusalem is burning. Everyone has to get out of Jerusalem, but they don't necessarily have to get out of Israel. They can go to other towns, but a lot of them start leaving. They go all over the place. And I'd like to pick up and talk a little bit. Now we're going to track what's happening to the Jews. So there are two tracks we need to follow, two stories. The first is the story of the Jews over here in Mesopotamia, and the millions that never left, and the Jews of Israel that are being now scattered all around the Mediterranean. Okay, so in the east, the Jews here, they were safe with Parthia, because Parthia let everybody worship how they wanted to, as long as they played by the rules. They were, and what they did is the Jews here began to write down everything that had been passed down orally over the years. They started to be concerned that based on what had happened with Jerusalem, with the temple being destroyed again, that the religion wasn't safe. They better start recording the things that had been passed down for thousands of years orally. So you've heard about words like Mishnah and Talmud and so forth. These are things that are writing, they're writings, okay? And most of those writings were done in the East. Okay. Now these Jews were safe under the Persians, and then Islam conquered them in 616. And they were safe under Islam too. The Muslims made them pay a tax. they were safe because the people that were ruling Islam in the time were from this area, and they were pretty good people. They were pretty easy people. Their situation got bad at around 800 AD, but they had 800 good years. Okay. Now we'll pick up that story for 800, but now let's go back to Rome and let's see what happened over the 800 years there. Okay, so let's compare these 800 years in the Roman Empire. Now the first 300 years, generally Christians and Jews, even Gentile Christians and Jews, well, there was reasonable communication and so forth. But in 100 AD, we had the first recorded writing of something.
Okay.
We had the first recorded writing. In fact, that light is a signal that our story is going to turn a bit darker. It's true.
It's true.
In 180 AD, Ignatius of Antioch said, "Don't eat Passover with the Jews." Don't eat Passover. In 200 AD came the Origin Declaration. Not only are Jews responsible for killing Jesus, they are dangerous enemies. Now, just because one famous and leader says something about the Jews doesn't mean that everything changes right away. Like I said, for the first 300 years, there was pretty good cooperation, but you started to get these writings. Okay? People started putting words out there. You know what happens when words go out there? It allows the ability to actualize and transfer thought. Words allow to transfer thought, and those words were going to have an impact, as we see. By 300 AD, we began to see things like, statements like that the biblical promises are meant for the church and that curses were meant for the Jews. In other words, when you read the Old Testament, if you see something good, take it for you as being part of the church. But if it's something bad, well then we'll leave that for the Jews. Okay. This is the seed of what Sandy mentioned earlier, replacement theology.
You were talking about the church fathers then.
Yes.
If you quote Ignatius and Origin.
Yes.
Can you give me a name for what you just said there?
I'll have to look that up on my notes. Yes.
I can give you some too.
And then in 312 AD, Constantine legalized Christianity. And in 325, Constantine, did I say Constantine? In 325, Constantine held together the Nicene Council. And this is where we get the Nicene, well, I don't know if Nicene Creed came right away.
No.
Didn't, yeah. But he convened the first council at Nicene. And what they did in this council was, sorry, I don't know how to. Okay, what they did in this council, the Council of Nicaea in 325, is they established the rule for Easter. That Easter will be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon. I don't. If that's okay. I mean.
Sure.
So hey, I've got more light. Okay, so established Easter would be the first Sunday of the first full moon after the spring equinox, which separated it from Passover.
They call it Easter then?
Yes, well, in Latin or whatever. But yes, it was already named Easter at that time. But in that same statement that Constantine was responsible for drafting most of, it goes on to say this. It begins to say that we should begin to withdraw ourselves from Jews, from that detestable association. We see this this is Article 4 of the document. This is, you pull this up on the internet, it's really easy to find. We have we have nothing in common with that most hostile people, the Jews. We have received another way from the Savior. In our holy religion, we have set before us a course which is both valid and accurate. Let us unanimously pursue this. Let us, most honored brothers, withdraw ourselves from that detestable association. It is truly most absurd for them to boast that we are incapable of rightly observing these things without their instruction. On what subject are they competent to form a correct judgment, who, after that murder of their Lord, lost their senses and are not led by any rational motive, but by an uncontrollable impulsiveness to wherever their innate fury may drive them? This is why even in this matter they do not perceive the truth, so that they constantly err in the utmost degree, and will celebrate the feast of Passover a second time in the same year, instead of making a suitable correction.
What is that referencing during two Passovers?
It's referencing the calendar that God gave to the Israelites in Sinai. He defined a calendar that would be based on the moon. And based on that calendar, it would be possible in certain cases for two Passovers to be held within 365 days of each other.
So these fathers are just negating the whole biblical
Yes, they
calendar.
do not realize what the calendar, because the calendar isn't clean, it isn't written just so you could read the Old Testament and exactly know immediately. I mean, you have to kind of know some of the history and so yes, they are separating themselves from that. Okay. Then in 400 AD. We have Saint Chrysostom, and he wrote that how do you say that? Chrysostom. Okay. I checked that, but I missed it. Okay, missed it twice. Okay. So a synagogue, he said, a synagogue is a brothel and a theater, a cave of pirates, and the lair of wild beasts. And the Jews behave no better than hogs and goats in their lewd grossness and the excesses of their gluttony. And that was the warm-up. That was the warm-up, because really what he said, what he taught is these three main items, and he hit on these items over the course of his teachings. First, that the Jews are a demon-possessed people. Second, that they cannot be forgiven because of what they did. I mean, like in the way that, Judas killed, he betrayed and then hung himself, and so there's different views on this, that Judas can't be forgiven for that. So if you're killing Christ, you can't be forgiven. That was his view theologically, okay? It's not you just trying to be mean, it's just, the other stuff is trying to be mean. And then he says, so therefore, based on this logic, it is the responsibility of Christians to hate Jews. Now, this wasn't necessarily acted on yet, but by, this is right at about 400, I believe. Then right at 500, by 500 AD, we start to see words that had been spoken turning into restrictions. So we have Emperor Justinian, who's giving this Justinian code prohibiting the Jews from building synagogues. By the way, I can send you these slides, and I can even send you my notes if you want. I'm happy to just email me if you want. I know this is a lot. He prohibited Jews from building synagogues and reading the Bible in Hebrew, assembling in public. But he also didn't like the Samaritans. Remember the northern part of Israel? And if you came from that area. Okay. Jews cannot testify against Christians in court. Banned Jewish judges and administrators. They cannot hold public office. And then the Council of Orleans. Banning the Jews from appearing on the streets during the 4 days prior to Easter. This is going to be very important in just a few minutes. Remember this, the banning them for 4 days. And then Jews can't own Christian slaves or employ Christian servants. Okay, that's 500. So we've got restrictions now. By 600, the Jews were not allowed to own land, to be farmers, or to enter certain trades. This is what forced them into finance. This stereotype of Jews with money? Yeah. Because they were restricted from doing other things. They were actually farmers. Most Jews in Israel way back. And then we had the first killings of Jews by the Byzantines in the 600s. Then That's too soon. I believe that might be the 700s that were first killings of by the Byzantines. By the 800s, 855, we had the Jews exiled from Italy. This is the first national exile, not just a city exile, but a national exile. Italy steps up into the forefront again and gets rid of their Jews. Now, where did these Jews go? They went to, if they're being exiled from Rome and Italy, from all of Italy, they have to get out of Italy. Well, they will go up into either France or Germany. And God provided a way for them. And his name was Charlemagne.
Oh, yeah.
The grandfather, the son, and Charlemagne was a progressive Christian king, and he took them in. And thus began the golden age of the Jews in Northern Europe, which lasted a mere 100 years.
He also stopped the Muslim invasion in 732.
Yes.
Portier or whatever. I didn't know he held the Jews too.
Yes, he was friendly to the Jews. He had already had Jewish advisors, and so he went ahead and invited the Jews to come up. And thus began what is now today known as Ashkenazi Judaism. That's where it started. It started in this area, France and Germany, under Charlemagne, and then they had to spread, and they made it all the way to Soviet Union, went all over the place, and there's a long history. But that's where the Ashkenazis came from. Okay. And we're about to do Sephardic. So let's switch back to the east. Now, because we're about at 800, and now things are starting to get bad for the Jews in the east because more militant Muslims from Mecca and Medina are taking control. And they're putting pressure on the Muslim leaders in Mesopotamia to start pressing down on the Jews and the Christians. And in 807 AD, we have the first case of forcing Jews to wear a yellow star. 807 AD. And Christians got to wear a blue star. Christians were persecuted too in that way. Okay. And over time, things got worse and worse. The Jews started leaving. First, they tried to go to Damascus. Didn't work for very long. Then they moved down to Egypt. Couldn't stay there either. Then they ended up moving over to Libya. And finally over into this area of North Africa. And they met up with the Berbers and the Moors of North Africa. And that was a good relationship for them. They were able to live peacefully in North Africa in this 800, 900. And in 100 years, the Muslims were going to take Spain, and so they began to move up into Spain. And by around 900 AD began the golden age of Judaism in Europe, in Spain. It's the golden age. And it lasted, the good period went through about 1400. Okay?
I got lost. You were talking about two different groups of Jews?
Yes, yes.
I got lost.
Okay, so good. That means I'm sure others did too. So we were talking about all of the Jews in the Roman Empire, and that especially those in Italy were getting expelled in around 800, and that they went up into France and Germany under Charlemagne and started Ashkenazi Judaism. Okay?
And Charlemagne was a pope?
He was king.
Emperor,
king.
Holy Roman Emperor.
Yeah.
Okay, Holy Roman.
That's where he was.
Charles the Great.
Okay, and so then we're switching back and said, well, what happened to the Jews in Mesopotamia? There's millions of Jews here, and they lived peacefully for 800 years. So what happened is they had to leave. I mean, not all of them, but the bulk of them started to leave. And the main route was to head to North Africa. And then, in another 100 years, many of them pushed on up into Spain, and thus began the golden age of Jews in Europe in Spain. It lasted 500 years. So it only lasted 100 years in Northern Europe, but it lasted 500 years in Spain. Okay, and so now we're up to around the 1300s, late 1300s. And so let's make our way. We're gonna cover this thing that happened in Spain, but now I need to catch you up between 800 and 1300 up here, right? I've gotten you to 800 in Northern Europe. So what happened in Northern Europe? Okay, all right. By 1000 AD, I'll leave my cursor here in Northern Europe to remind you that's where we're talking. In 1000 AD, where the forced conversions began in Northern Europe. 1000 AD. It's like you leave, and if you're not willing to convert, then you can leave, or we can kill you. This was happening in Northern Europe. Began to happen in 1000 AD. Also in that century. Also in that century began the first pogroms. I never really knew what that word was, pogroms. It's basically the way I understand it is, it's a group of people who are very mad and angry and have whatever they're holding and rush into a village and do whatever they feel like.
Would you spell it?
So burn, pillage, sexual stuff, killings, murders, all that. Whatever they
Fiddler
were.
on the Roof is pogroms they're talking about.
And that would happen. That started in 1000 AD and would continue on for the next 1,000 years in Northern Europe. See, these things are building on each other. When I say that something in the past, and I don't mention it, it doesn't mean that it went away, usually. It just means that it isn't new anymore. I'm giving you what is new. Now, Christians are... now we have the first events of 4,000 or 6,000 Jews dying at one event, one night, or one pogrom. That we're starting to see things, not just pockets of Jews, but it can be up to into the thousands now. Christians are now forbidden to stay in a Jewish home. If they have a bed and breakfast, don't go there. Then the first crusades to the Holy Land began. But on the way to the Holy Land, on their way through Europe, they kill 1/4 of all of the Jews in France and Germany. And this is in the late 1000 time frame. By 1099, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, and they rounded up the Jews in Jerusalem. They drove them into a synagogue there. They burned the synagogue down while singing outside, "Christ, we adore thee." That's one.
So they were thinking they were doing the work of God.
Yeah.
The Crusaders.
Yeah.
Of killing all the Jews.
Yeah.
And you wonder why the Jews don't like us.
Okay, so now in the 1100s, back in Northern Europe, we have the first mock crucifixion and ritual murder accusation. There started to be an accusation that Jews would pretend to kill Christ over again, either in effigy or taking a live person and hanging. It was an accusation. Now, it was never proved. But this is only 1100, and we got more to go in this story. Basically, what happened was a little boy was found on the eve of Easter dead, and the Jews in the town were accused of murdering this little boy. We don't have any cases of Jews actually having evidence for these things that they're being accused of here. Okay, then we start to have issues during Palm Sunday and Easter. That began to be a time to get the parishioners riled up to go attack the Jewish section of the town. So, can you believe this? That during Holy Week, you'd send out people to burn and beat and whatever they feel like doing. Burning Christians, yes.
Sort of.
Well,
Sort of Christian.
they call it.
Okay. Then in 1200 in England, they didn't kill their Jews in England, but they began to tax the Jews to pay for the Crusades. They began to tax them 25% of their, you earned $30,000 last year, we want 25% of that right now. Pay up right now, 25% tax, special tax on top of everything else, to pay for the Crusades. Because we're only doing this because of what you did. That's what we're
This
saying.
is all Catholic Church led now, because there was nothing else, right? But this is Catholic Church.
Yes.
1200s, the yellow badge of shame is now brought to Northern Europe, made its way from the Middle East now. Now, in 1200s, everything is just going crazy. Jews are being expelled in Italy, France. They got expelled in England in 1290 and would be expelled for 400 years. France expelled the Jews like 10 times. They would expel them, but then not really enforce it, and then they'd kind of make their way back or not leave. Or France was just chaotic. Italy expelled their Jews multiple times. And by the 1300s, we had the accusation of the desecration of the host. The desecration of the host relates to communion. We have the bread and the wine. And this accusation was that the Jews would take bread that was going to be used for communion and take it off into their homes or whatever and hit it, stick it with knives or pins or whatever, and then deliver it back to the place,
So who are
the
these
bakers.
people making the accusation? I mean, can you define them in any kind of?
The people of which the standard religion was Christian. Then in the mid 1300s came the Black Plague, which killed about at least 30% of everyone in Europe, Jews and non-Jews alike. The Jews were accused of starting the Black Plague by poisoning wells. The Jews were dying too, but they weren't dying quite as much because some of them were keeping their houses more free of rats than other people. And so there was a little bit difference in the death rate for Jews, and that was used as evidence that they must be behind this. And now we move to ritual murder accusations that the Jews would take a kid and I'm sorry, sorry to even have to say this. They would take a kid, the accusation was they would take a kid, kill him, and then use the blood to make their bread for Passover.
A goat kid or a human?
A real kid.
Human
Sorry,
child.
a real kid.
Human
I mean,
child.
a human kid. And then in the 1400s, things got worse, and still, I won't go into all the details. And then we had the first Jewish ghetto in Italy that was coming, where Jews were cordoned off into their own neighborhood, basically a prison. Can't leave. Okay, take a breath. Take a breath. Now we got to move over to Spain. Here in Spain, the Jews were rising in society. This is where things were the best. But the fact that the Jews were rising in society was causing Jews to become bosses of Gentiles. And Gentiles didn't like this. And somehow there was this massacre of the Jews in Seville, Spain in 1391. And that was like a tipping point. It's like, okay, there's a Jewish problem here. What do we do with it? And by 1411, the idea was, okay, we'll just force them to become Christians. Because that'll solve the problem. We'll just force them. And many did convert. Many. And in fact, even I've heard Jews say, I've heard Orthodox Jewish historians say, it couldn't have all been forced. Some of it had to be, really. But again, as they rose in society, the Gentiles, Christians, began to accuse their Jewish bosses of not really converting. You had 100,000, 200,000 Jews that converted, said they converted, but they weren't sure. And so they began to be accused. So the solution to that was to inquire. All right, We're going to inquire with each person. And thus became the Spanish Inquisition. We're going to find out if they really converted. So, and the way that works is you're guilty until proven innocent. And you are tortured, and if during the midst of your torture you ever blurt out, you admit that you were still Jewish, practicing Jewish practices, in order to stop the pain of the torture, then of course you were known to be Jewish. And eventually, by 1492, was the decision between King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel to expel the Jews. And this is called the Spanish Expulsion of 1492. And so they expelled the Jews. They gave them 3 months to get out, but it took them 1 month to get organized. And so they extended the date from June 30th to July 31st, to extend the date. And so that was the date that everybody had to be out. And the date of their expulsion on the Jewish calendar fell on the month of Av, on the 9th day. Now, why is that important? Because back in history, not everything, but some of the worst tragedies in Jewish history have happened on that same date on the Jewish calendar. Now, it bounces around between July and August on our calendar, but on the Jewish calendar, it was always the 9th of Av. The second temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av. The first temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av. There was a revolt by Bar Kokhba in 135. That was crushed on the 9th of Av. Later in history, the day that the Nazis gathered in a town and decided to implement the final solution in a 45-minute presentation in 1941 was on the 9th of Av. Interestingly, World War I also started on 9th of Av. But where does this trace back to? It traces back to the spies in the desert. And the Jews know this. They remember that the day that they decided that the spies gave the bad report on that calendar on that year was the 9th of Av. And now it's time to take a breath as we move towards our close. On the day after the 9th of Av, Christopher Columbus got on the boat and left on his first voyage and found the new land. And God opened up South America first and then North America later as a haven for the Jews. But that wasn't going to help right away. That was going to take 100 years for that full infrastructure to develop. It wasn't going to help right away. So God bless a Muslim named Bayezid II, because what he did was he was ruling from Turkey at the time in the Ottoman Empire, and he heard about this expulsion, and he said, Ferdinand, Isabela, you're crazy. These people help build a good quality society. I want these people. So he commandeered every boat he had in his army, and he sent it to the Spanish coast and said, get on a boat and we'll take you somewhere safe. And he ended up distributing them all around the Mediterranean. So,
what was the date on that?
1492.
Oh, same year.
The boats came in the last weeks before the 9th of Av. And he also took some of them to Turkey. There are some Jews in Turkey today. Part of that population comes from this event. And then God's looking down on this, and he's saying, like, this, look, Northern Europe is a mess, what they're doing with the Jews. Spain has now expelled their Jews, and this was the best place for the Jews in all of Europe. And then, that Jewish ghetto in Italy that I talked about, that was formed in 1516. 1516 was the Jewish ghetto. And I believe that in 1517, God said, I've had enough. And he started a clock. Let me tell you about the things that began to happen then. In 1517, Suleiman the Magnificent, the successor of Bayezid, captures Jerusalem and takes it for the Ottoman Empire. And he's a good guy. What he does is he rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, just like Nehemiah. First, he captures Jerusalem and didn't do it in a harsh way. And then he rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem over the next some years. And the Ottoman Empire is thriving. And Jews are all around the Ottoman Empire. And then in Northern Europe, Martin Luther looks at the excesses of the Catholic Church and says, I've got to do something. And so on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther writes a letter to the bishop with the 95 Theses of the things that are wrong with the Catholic Church. And that began, as we know, the Protestant Reformation in 1517. Now, Martin Luther was became a horrible anti-Semite. The last sermon he ever preached, 1 week before his death, was a sermon against the Jews. What he did was he set the stage for Hitler to have justification to do what Hitler did with the Final Solution. He wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies, and he gave 7 recommendations for how to deal with Jews, and Hitler took up every single one of them in 1933. And then in 41 he went on and said, now I'm going to take that and step it up even to one more level to the Final Solution. Now we know about the Holocaust. That's all I'm going to say about the Holocaust. But for all of the tragedy of Martin Luther personally, he did something well. He taught us to pick up a Bible and read it, thanks to the printing press that was invented in the mid-1400s, to read it for ourselves. And people, over the next couple of hundred years, began reading things like this. Jeremiah 23:3. But I, God, I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all countries where I have driven them, and bring them back to their folds, and they shall be fruitful and increase. And then they began to see other things, like this. God speaking again, Jeremiah 24. For I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them and not pull them down. I will plant them and not pluck them up. And also they began to read things like this. Chapter 32. Behold, I will gather them out of all the countries where I have driven them in my anger and in my fury and in great wrath, and I will bring them back to this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely. Words do matter. And in the same way that in the early parts of the millennium, people began to speak words against the Jews, now, in the late 1500s and 1600s, people, some Catholic, some Protestant, maybe more Protestant, began to speak out the words of promise and the words of hope.
William Tyndale did the same thing in England.
And yes, and bless the Lord for that. And in 400 years from 1517, on October 31st, 1917, the cabinet of the Prime Minister of England would issue the Balfour Declaration, which says, when we're coming into the Holy Land and we're going to take it, when we take it, we're not going to take it for our own purposes. We're going to take it to provide a homeland for the Jews. And this declaration was signed in England 400 years to the day of the Protestant Reformation. Okay? And then, about 40 days later, General Edmund Allenby of the British Army walks into Jerusalem on December 11th, taking Jerusalem without firing a shot. General Allenby is a Bible-believing Christian. He knows the importance of what it means for a ruler to come into Jerusalem. So he gets off of his horse And he says, I shall not ride into Jerusalem because only the Messiah shall ride on a horse into Jerusalem. And he gets off his horse and walks in. This is an actual photograph of that walking in to receive the official surrender.
Wow.
So 400 years. Remember that number from earlier? I said we're going to need that later. 400 years. To the year and part of it to the day. 400 years. And then in 30 years more, from 1917, after World War II, the United Nations would come together under the leadership of the United States and President Harry Truman and would enact UN Resolution 181 on November 29th, establishing a homeland for the state of Israel. Isaiah 66:1 says, can a land be born in one day? Can a nation be brought forth all at once? That prophecy was fulfilled on this day, and also it was filled again in 48 when they took possession. But this decision legalized the land and made it possible. And this was 430 years after God started that clock. Remember the number 430. Okay? And then 20 years later is the Six-Day War in 1967. And the Western Wall and the Temple Mount come under Jewish control. Jerusalem is unified under Jewish control for the first time in 1878 years. 1967, and this is 20 years. Do you remember the time that Jacob spent outside of the country when he went out? He went out for 20 years. But he came, so it took 20 more years for them to get Jerusalem. They had the country. Now they had Jerusalem. And here we are tonight in early 2018, having just passed 500 years from this clock. 500 years being the amount of time from the birth of Abraham to the Exodus. May God be praised for remembering the Jewish people as he has. And now it's going to be time to turn our eyes towards the present. So that's what we'll do next week. I appreciate your patience and your indulgence for me going over time tonight. This is by far the most material that we'll have to go through. So thank you very much.